name is Sam Jenks, and welcome to another episode of The Way We Source, a podcast hosted by Kodiak Hub, where we share our talks with procurement practitioners, leaders, experts, consultants, content gurus, and people that we find downright inspiring, diving into the role that sourcing and procurement plays in the way we live. If you like today's episode, make sure to rate the program and give us a follow. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting a catalyst of procurement technology and the procurement tech startup landscape. He's a real digital procurement advisor, a mover and shaker in the space. He advises global multinationals and tech vendors alike with over 20 years of experience in the procurement space as a prior practitioner turned consultant turned entrepreneur. He is the founder of ProcurementSoftware.site, and we are super excited to have him on today's episode, Mr. James Meads. James, welcome to the show, or dare I say maybe welcome back to the show. You are our second Hall of Fame episode. How does that feel?
Wow, I feel privileged. Thank you, Sam. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me back. Always love doing these.
Well, the second one is harder. You know, they say pressure is a privilege, though. So we're happy to have you.
Let's see if we can live up to the hype.
All right. In the last episode, I started by asking you, what does sourcing and procurement mean to you? Do you still agree with your response?
Yeah, I had to listen back knowing that you were probably going to ask me this. And yeah, I do actually. We still, in a lot of instances, are battling against being seen as a back office function. And while that is changing, it's changing a lot slower than I would like it to. I'm a pretty impatient person just in terms of my character. And yeah, it frustrates me when things happen so slowly. So we are moving in the right direction, but I just think, especially now with everything that we're seeing around how AI is disrupting the way that we work and the way that business and commerce is done, I just think we need to move much, much faster to stay relevant.
Do you have any kind of, how would I say, crystal ball moment? Do you see anything that's going to be the tip of the spear that's going to move the needle for procurement to become more strategic?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think there will be, if you look at the standard, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats in a SWOT diagram, there are a lot of, with the opportunities and threats typically being the external factors. Right. There are a lot of externalities geopolitically right now. Right. So, I mean, I think that's going to be a catalyst. But I also think that just the pace that technology is moving at, if we can't articulate our value beyond just being the process and compliance police, we're going to become pretty irrelevant pretty soon, because that's a fairly predictable process. And it's something that you don't have to be a great technological genius to predict that AI is probably going to be able to do that fairly soon.
Well, I think it's important for our listeners to have a little bit of background. Why are you the man that's allowed to make these statements? Which we love that you're an opinionated person, and that's what we like to hear. It's boring otherwise, to be frank. I mean, what are you guys doing at ProcurementSoftware.site? After 20 years in the industry, where are you at today as the founder of that particular organization?
Yeah, so I mean, to take a step back, I think one of the reasons, other than wanting to have time and location freedom, one of the reasons why I ultimately left corporate was I oftentimes felt like a very well-paid admin assistant when I looked at what did my typical day look like. Probably between a third and a half of what I was doing day to day, with a little bit of planning, you could probably have outsourced it to an admin assistant. And now if we look, when was that? End of 2018 when I quit corporate. So 6.5 years on, there's a substantial portion that could have been done by an AI agent if we look at the state of play in 2025. So at ProcurementSoftware.site, ultimately, we started off as a podcast in 2020 during the first COVID lockdown. And as I interviewed procurement tech founders and started to learn more about the space, that was great in terms of a siloed conversation. But I was kind of like, well, okay, that's great. But then how does the listener then relate that back to, okay, well, what else is out there in the marketplace? Who are that company's competitors? How does it fit in with the wider tech landscape? And that just led me to think we need some sort of digital yearbook or database that is not sponsored content and that doesn't cost 5 figures to have a subscription, and that only really big consultancies and Fortune 500 companies can afford. So that was really the catalyst behind what drove me to do it. I wanted to democratize access to being able to search and find procurement tech, but without having to rely on software companies to sponsor it, to earn money from it. So it's a completely agnostic, this isn't a sales pitch, but it's a completely agnostic database. It's free to use on the front end. We do have a paid back end, but that's mainly geared towards VCs, consultancies, procurement tech companies looking to do competitor analysis. The average practitioner that's just looking to see what's out there can use the free version. And that's really what we set out to do.
Yeah, and we thank you for it. I mean, the democratization of, search is important because, like you said, otherwise these networks have been very gated. What sets you apart from some of those other agencies beyond maybe the fact that you're looking at a more, how would I say, open rather than pay to play model?
Yeah, so the big thing that sets us apart is that we target, in terms of our marketing and our copy and who we feature on there, we're looking to help more the smaller procurement teams in mid-market businesses, or even if you look at high growth tech companies, people that are coming into a greenfield procurement role, rather than the big corporates that have got center of excellence teams that can go and afford to buy a subscription to someone like a Gartner or a Spend Matters. I'm not bad mouthing what they do. I think they have a good product, but it's very focused towards those very big corporate procurement teams.
Great insights. We talked about it the last time that we spoke, this classic build versus buy discussion, right? As somebody that's in the space and working alongside so many practitioners that are, really wrestling with this question, as well as so many tech vendors as well that are trying to make their stamp in the industry. I think that we've seen that the market has grown so broad that the idea of building can be quite an unnecessary undertaking. You mentioned when we were offline that there's no reason to be building anymore unless if it's an agentic agent. I mean, can you expand upon that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, fundamentally, I would question, why would you, as a procurement team with an in-house IT department, think that you're going to be able to build something better than all of the VC money that's gone into procure tech? That would be my fundamental argument. Yes, you might be, if you're really smart, you might be able to build something a little bit cheaper, because there's a cost to be able to go out and buy an off-the-shelf software as a service. Companies like Kodiak Hub have to recruit salespeople and spend money on marketing. So yes, there's always going to be a premium to that. But what makes you think, and especially when you look at things like UI, UX, these are very specific skills that an in-house IT team managing perhaps an outsourced software development team in maybe someone like Eastern Europe or India, they might be technically brilliant at what they do, but then we all know, it's common knowledge that user adoption in procurement tech is really poor a lot of the times. There are various percentages bounded around there, and I'm not quite sure where they get their data from, but I think we can all agree that user adoption typically is pretty low and the failure rate is high. So unless you've got really, really slick UI UX, there's a high chance that your initiative will fail. And that's before we even get into, do you have the in-house expertise to be able to manage a bunch of Indian or Ukrainian software developers? It's not an easy task. You might just think, let's hire an agency and they can go out and build it. You've got to stay on your toes and you've got to manage them. So Is that a core role of procurement? I would argue probably not. Now, is there a case where you can go out and build software? Yes, I still think there is. I mean, let's look at the simpler end of the market. If you, and I've actually got experience, we've just built something that we're about to soft launch in a couple of weeks' time. But if you're a small procurement team and you just want to have a very simple app for something like contract repository or supplier onboarding or reporting your savings initiatives in something that's a little bit nicer looking and easy for external users to be, non-procurement users to be able to log into and view project progress. Yes, there's a case to be able to build something like that in-house now. There's been so much advancement in a lot of these no-code platforms. It might seem bizarre talking about procurement tech, but I'm not a tech guy by background. I'm a procurement professional. I don't have a degree in computer science. I'm not good at maths and statistics and typically the kind of things that would make a good software developer. So with the tech that's available now as a no-code platform, I've been able to build that pretty easy. There's a learning curve, but it's something that anyone with the time that wants to have a bit of a hobby project over the weekend or during the evening can figure out. So there is a case to say, okay, if you're a small procurement team and you don't want to go out and spend $25K on an entry-level piece of software, you can go out and build something simple to solve a very specific point solution problem. And AI agents is another one that if you've got specific workflow that you want to build an agent to be able to do, there's a case to say, yes, you may be able to build that rather than purchase an off-the-shelf solution. But again, do you have the resource to do it? Because you're probably not going to do it in-house. Procurement teams don't have a team of software developers working for them, right? So, I mean, who's going to manage that project? So, yes, you can do it. It's a case of how much resource do you have, and how skilled is your team and organization to be able to write an accurate scope of work and to be able to manage software developers.
Yeah. And I think that comes back to what you were just mentioning, right? You can go out to market and, like you said, for an entry level package, be in a range of a 25K, scaling up depending upon scope, I'm sure, and the maturity of the tech vendor that you're working with, right? What I'm curious of though is, do teams believe that they can get by with spending less on in-house development, right? There is an element here, of course, of by not investing, there's a massive cost of inaction, right? Let's not even talk about the ROI of this whole thing. I mean, you are substantially falling behind, competitors that are in the market that are out there and investing. But what we also know is that procurement only gets 17% of the technology that they want to buy. That's a Gartner statistic from 2024. It might be a bit outdated. It's likely from a particular industry vertical. I'm stating it's a little bit more wide sweeping, right? I guess my question to you is what do you see are those biggest barriers why procurement teams don't get the technology from third-party vendors that are out there on the market, excuse me, with fitting solutions? What is the barrier for them to getting to buy the solutions that they need?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and every case is going to be different, but there are some general principles. Procurement has a bit of a Cinderella complex within an organization. And part of that is procurement leaders are hired essentially to save money. So they tend to adapt that mindset themselves when it comes to tech investments. And they seem to have this, and it's a good quality in a lot of ways, right? Don't get me wrong. They have this very stoic mindset of, we'll just battle through and we'll make do with what we have. And I understand where that's coming from. If procurement often has to lead by example when it comes to saving costs, but I do think that that's a bit of a false economy, and you're letting down the wider business through trying to muddle through and manage your contracts in Excel or manage your, talking to what you guys do, managing your SRM in spreadsheets. Sales wouldn't do it. And there's a good reason why sales wouldn't do it. It's because it impacts their ability to drive revenue and close customers. So if you flip that, then it's impacting procurement's ability to will not only drive savings, but also drive top line value through, if we take SRM as an example, through being able to look at top line innovation and be able to have a platform where we can collaborate with our suppliers on more strategic stuff rather than just measuring hard KPIs. So I think that's one part. I think the other part is historically, we've not been good communicators in terms of articulating our value just beyond cost cutting. And, that's always going to be a part of our role. It's always going to be what gives you the business case as a CPO to hire an extra category manager.
Right.
But you can't cost cut your way to being a world-class organization. Apple isn't where it is because they cut costs. Apple's where it is because they're so innovative and they have a world-class supply chain. Yeah, let's not forget that. But Apple's not a $2 or $3 trillion company because they cut costs ruthlessly.
Okay. I don't know if our editors are going to like me whistling, but it was too much of a hot take not to, honestly. Entrepreneurial procurement, you mentioned, and I think that this piggybacks quite nicely off of what you were just talking about. It's an important topic. Like, procurement as a function needs to have a more entrepreneurial mindset. And like you just said, right, the board, the C-suite, if procurement's not in it, it goes against the fiber to say, hey, this particular function that's here to create savings, let's invest in them more. I mean, where do you think that an entrepreneurial spirit can be able to support a procurement organization with exactly some of these challenges and more?
I think it all starts with, and one of the things that I realized, after building ProcurementSoftware.site and talking a lot about the technology, tech is an important piece of the puzzle, but it's a small piece of the puzzle. Yeah. You can buy clunky tech and you can still have it succeed to some extent if you've got a world-class procurement organization and you're really good at change management. And then on the flip side,
right,
you can buy a fantastic piece of tech, but if you've got an immature procurement team, or if you have no mandate or influence within the organization, no matter how good the tech is, it will fail. So yeah. I was looking beyond that and I thought, okay, well, what more holistically, how do procurement teams need to act and think to be able to leverage SaaS and AI, but to be able to make a bigger impact? And I think beyond the tech, we need to adopt and use the skills of a business owner mindset to be able to think longer term and drive value beyond just the 12 months of savings that typically procurement reports and is measured on. And by that, I mean, a lot of the big one that I see everywhere that I look is there's a huge amount of what I call white collar waste within procurement. Just to use a classic example, if the procure to pay process was a process in a factory, there's so much waste in there. You would have lean consultants crawling all over it, trying to find out why that factory is causing so much scrap or so much rework or waste. But because it's an office-based process, it doesn't get looked at. You could apply the same argument to how there's a lot of waste in government, which there's a lot of headlines right now about what DOGE is doing in the US. I'm not going to get political here, but I think it's generally acknowledged that there's a lot of waste in the public sector. So I think the whole aspect of this is looking at, okay, what processes can you just get rid of because they're not necessary? And I would say, filling out forms to get approval to go on business trips is one of those. It's a completely unnecessary process. Just take your travel budget and divide it between each team and give people the agency and the ownership of that budget to be able to make a sensible decision. So eliminate is one. And then, okay, what can you delegate then to more junior members of the team? And that's going to increasingly become less relevant as technology progresses. And then the third one, obviously, is what can you automate? And that's when we get into, okay, how can we use technology to not only just improve the quality of data and the way that we visualize it, but also how can we make our end-to-end processes more efficient and more autonomous? And I think until we do that, we're going to continue to be buried in this never-ending cycle of we don't have enough resources to be able to do what we should be doing. Because we're probably not going to get more resource. We have to be honest with ourselves that procurement's probably not going to get massive investment into people. If anything, CFOs and chief people officers are looking around thinking, with the AI revolution, we probably need to slim down our headcount. And in European business, especially where labor law makes it much more difficult to fire people, I think it's going to be very difficult to make the argument to get extra headcount. So how can we get more done with the existing resources that we have? The only way we're going to do that is to think more business-like in the way that we run our operations and be very ruthless in the way that we cut waste.
Interesting insights. There's a phrase that I paraphrase from Sam Blon, the CRO extraordinaire. He was at Brex, for example. He says, more salespeople do not equal more sales. Headcount doesn't always deliver the returns that you're looking for. I think the same could be said for procurement. More procurement people does not equal more savings. I think that beautiful balance between, again, the classic people, process, and technology is important. I'm curious, though, is there a risk with this entrepreneurial spirit? Procurement's the driver of process and compliance, right? We just talked about it before. How does a business, and especially a procurement organization, break out of that particular mindset and also sell in to the rest of the organization the requirement for pragmatism?
Yeah, I mean, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. So I'm certainly not saying that we need to get rid of all of the process that we have. There has to be process and compliance, and that most definitely has to sit within procurement if we're the custodian of a company's spend. But fundamentally, I see it's a very different skill set and personality of a person that enjoys and is more excited by risk and compliance and regulatory type activity than it is a person that's more into being the visionary and the innovator and the entrepreneur. So those two roles definitely belong within the same procurement organization. But I would argue that procurement has typically hired based on the former. If you go out and read 100 procurement job descriptions, not that we're going to, but if you went out and picked,
well, ChatGPT could do that for us if you want to.
Yeah, I was going to say AI can do it now. Yeah, so if you got an AI to scrape something like Indeed.com and scraped 100 category manager or strategic sourcing manager roles, probably have a guess that 80 out of those 100 are going to be asking for fairly technocratic qualities and experiences and skill sets. And my argument would be it needs to be a lot more balanced, probably needs to be 50-50, because you need to have the entrepreneurs, the visionaries, the innovators as part of your team as well. And those two can complement each other. You've got one that will rein the other in if he gets a little bit too wild in his visions. So yeah, they're two very different, but they're very equally important skill sets and personalities. So I wouldn't say one's more important than the other, but I certainly think technocracy is being prioritized over entrepreneurship and vision right now if you look at the typical procurement job descriptions.
Okay, so let's dig into that. Why are procurement teams obsessed with the technocrats?
I think that the expansion of procurement teams has been largely driven by increasing amounts of bureaucracy and regulation. And I think that's just being a self-fulfilling prophecy. But now, especially in the age of tech and in geopolitical uncertainty and the necessity to be nimble and agile to be able to become best in class, I've used this a few times in content that I've put out there. But best practice is what your competitors were doing 3 years ago. You can't just take an existing process and follow it. So I fundamentally think there needs to be a different change. There needs to be a shift in the mindset of how we recruit. Procurement in 2030 is going to be very, very different than procurement in 2020 or even 2025. So whereas historically procurement leaders had recruited for the hard skills, strategic sourcing, financial acumen, negotiation, category management, project management, data analysis, contract management, we've now, over the past 5 years, and if you talk to any procurement recruiter or headhunter, they'll all say this, there's a lot more focus now on soft skills, business partnering, communication skills, SRM, stakeholder management, change management, diplomacy, influence, and persuasion. And that I think will continue. That will stay relevant. But as we move towards 2030, we're going to see a lot more business-related skills necessary, as well as some of the typical hard procurement skills are going to be replaced to some extent by hard tech skills. Because if you've got AI that can do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to writing category strategies or writing and analyzing RFPs, entrepreneurship and being able to be agile in the way that you think is going to be part of it. And, being an effective communicator, what we're doing now, creating content, that's going to be vitally important in terms of how you communicate your messaging and your influence and your persuasive skills within the organization. It's a bit of a soundbite, but procurement is sales to a large extent when it comes to getting our initiatives implemented internally. Ask any procurement leader whether they find it easier to negotiate with suppliers or with internal stakeholders, and 90% of them will say it's easier to negotiate with suppliers because we typically have the power if we are the buyer rather than the seller, and there are clear consequences of the way that we negotiate with suppliers. Internally, historically, procurement in organizations has not had a strong mandate. So we're kind of the small kid at the back of the class trying to get attention. So the way that we communicate in our communication strategy, things like podcasts, like videos, like short form content, like posters, infographics, that's going to be really important. And you look at there's a lot of procurement creators on LinkedIn that are really good at doing infographics. I think if they're doing that internally with the way that they communicate with their stakeholders, rather than just trying to game the LinkedIn algorithm, I think they'll be super successful because it's a very concise, easy to read and engaging form of communication. So they can do that for their procurement policies or, something that initially would be quite dry and look like a legal document, that they're going to be they're going to increase their chances of being successful. And then, so some of the new skills that are going to come in terms of how we recruit, we're probably going to have data scientists or software developers on our team, or at least someone that's got a good understanding of how prompt engineering works or how AI and robotics works. I mean, I think nowadays you don't need to be a software developer to build an AI agent or some simple automation. I've done it myself in Airtable, for example, and I'm not a coder. So that's going to become ever more important because as a lot of the old skills from the past can be partially automated or done by AI, these new skills are going to become much more important.
Do you believe that procurement teams have a threat to the soft skills, however, and the next generation of talent that otherwise will be maybe a little bit more capable on some of those hard technical skills?
I think someone that's built their procurement career on the procurement skills of 10 years ago and hasn't really invested in both the soft skills and some of the new skills, I would be less inclined to recruit them than someone with no procurement experience, but that has the attention to detail and the right mindset to be able to learn the new skills. or that comes already with new skills. Now, I would be more inclined to train someone from sales in how to do procurement than someone with a very closed mindset that's got 20 years of category experience.
Great insights. And I think definitely the way that we need to think when we're sourcing new talent. And new talent is needed in the space, right? You've been in this space for, if my maths are correct, 23 years, 20 plus, we'll say. If you had to break things down into more distinct eras, if you were to break it down into 1 to 3, 1 to 2 to 3 eras of those 23 years, what would you have as kind of your big blocks of eras you've seen?
That's a great question. So I came into procurement in 2002. So it is pretty much, you've got it right, actually. It is coming up to 23 years. Procurement is a lot more professional now than it was back then. I mean, I joined in the automotive industry, which historically was, very male-dominated environment. So if I'd maybe gone into procurement in perhaps a service-based industry where it's a little bit more balanced in terms of gender, then I would perhaps have a different view on this. But it was quite normal back then to be able to go on corporate hospitality with suppliers to go and watch the football or the rugby. Part of it is I look back thinking, they were the good old days. It was fun. But that's kind of died a death now, certainly maybe not in industries like construction, where there's still a lot of that goes on. But it's a lot more transparent now. You have to be very, very careful what you do with suppliers and how you conduct yourselves, especially when it comes to hospitality and gifts. And I think, on balance, it's probably a good thing. I do think it's maybe harmed our ability to build trust and foster deeper relationships with suppliers in cultures that are very much driven on personal relationships.
Right.
If you go to somewhere like Italy, for example, it's if you don't have dinner or lunch with your suppliers, then it's very, very difficult to form a trusting business relationship with them. So part of it is definitely cultural. So I think certainly the professionalism, there's been certainly, and this is a bit that I don't like, there's a lot more bureaucracy now than there was then, for better, for worse. But I think on balance, probably for worse, in that it's slowed down and it's slowed down the pace that we can do things. And it's given us the reputation of being the department of no. And I think if anything, if AI can do that autonomously and can check against procurement policy or can check against process, that would be one of the most awesome ways that we could integrate AI into procurement.
Can I ask you real quick and just jump in here? Do you think that we've become, or procurement as a function has become kind of the function of no also, though, because they're so bogged down in trying to catch up, they don't have enough time to see the yeses. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think it's partially right in that we're having to say no to stuff because we simply don't have time to take it on, because we're in the weeds dealing with compliance issues or purchase to pay processes that are broken. So yeah. I certainly think there's some substance in that. I would then always argue to say, okay, but that is ultimately something that you can you're master of your own destiny to,
right,
to
you can
some
navigate
extent
that.
there.
Yeah.
You can navigate that by investing in some tech that's got a really great UI UX for P2P, so that will ensure a higher user adoption. So you can invest. You can overcome that by your internal processes. So yeah, I do think that's part of it. But I certainly think there's some truth in what you said. Yes.
Amazing insights from an amazing man. Now, James, you've done this before. We love to always do a quick fire with our guests, getting to know them as individuals a little bit more than the procurement experts that they are. So if it's okay with you, quick fire questions, one word or one sentence answers about you, James, not just about procurement and procurement technology. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
First one, if you weren't working in procurement, what would you be working with?
I would probably help people that want to relocate for lifestyle or geopolitical reasons.
Important stuff. Now, I know that you travel a lot yourself, avoiding the cold. What's the best country that you've been to during your recent travels, and why?
Argentina, because I love wine and steak.
A man after my own heart. If you are seeing procurement in 5 years' time, what's the one piece of advice that you would give a procurement professional that wants to look 5 years in the future?
Speak to your sales and marketing department and understand how they influence and persuade their customers or potential customers.
I saw a clip of Bezos, anyone that's in his exec team, they're not thinking about the next quarter, they're thinking about the next few years, right? And I think that resonates very well. And I think that there is a lot of learnings to be pulled. Procurement is a business function and is going to continue to be more business oriented. James, thanks for coming and dropping knowledge for our listeners on today's episode. Really appreciate it.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me back. Always good to catch up.